At 4 minutes past 7 on the morning of October 8, 1918, Private John Lewis crouched in a shell crater filled with 3 inches of freezing water, watching a German machine gun nest tear apart his company for the 3rd time that week. The Maxim gun sat 200 yards ahead, dug into a concrete pillbox with overlapping fields of fire that turned the Argonne forest into an abattoir. 27 men from his battalion had died trying to cross that ground in the past 72 hours. Lewis could see their bodies scattered across the mud, some still moving, crying for medics who couldn't reach them without being cut down themselves. He'd been carrying 8 grenades for the past 6 hours, their weight pulling at his cartridge belt, metal bodies cold against his ribs through the wet wool of his uniform. Standard doctrine said grenades were defensive weapons. Throw them when the enemy charged your trench. Use them to clear dugouts once you'd already taken ground. Nobody threw grenades at machine gun nests from 200 yards away. That would be suicide. That would be a waste of expensive munitions. That would violate every tactical principle taught at training camps from Georgia to Pennsylvania. But Lewis had grown up throwing rocks at moving targets. Not for fun, not for sport, throwing rocks to eat. In the Missouri Ozarks, you learned to hunt squirrels with stones before your family could afford to waste bullets on your education. By age 9, he could hit a running rabbit at 40 feet. By 12, he developed a peculiar overhand technique that gave his throws a flat trajectory, keeping the projectile low instead of arcing high where wind could catch it. His father, a railroad worker with hands like iron, had taught him that accuracy came from repetition, and that distance came from proper weight distribution. Every stone had a balance point. Find it, and you could make anything fly straight. Now, watching the machine gun traverse left and right, mowing down anyone who moved, Lewis thought about balance points. He thought about trajectory. He thought about the fact that nobody in command seemed to understand that you couldn't flank a position when both flanks were covered by interlocking fire. You couldn't suppress a concrete pillbox with rifle fire. You couldn't advance across open ground when one man with a Maxim could fire 500 rounds per minute at knee height. But maybe, just maybe, you could throw something heavy enough to reach it. The boy who learned to calculate. Lewis had left school after 6th grade to work the same railroad his father did, driving spikes into cross ties for 12 hours a day in heat that made the metal burn to touch. The work taught him about weight and force, about how a 7-pound hammer had to be swung at exactly the right angle to seat a spike without bending it. Too much force and you'd split the wood, too little and you'd waste motion. His foreman, an old Irishman named Doyle, who'd built track from St. Louis to San Francisco, used to say that every physical problem had a mathematical solution. You just had to observe the variables and adjust accordingly. When Lewis turned 16, he took a job at a limestone quarry, mixing dynamite charges to break rock faces. The powder men taught him about blast radius and fragmentation patterns, about how the same amount of explosive could either shatter stone into gravel or crack it into manageable blocks, depending on placement and tamping. They taught him to calculate. If the rock face is 18 feet high and the charge is planted 6 feet from the base at a 45-degree angle, where will the debris field end? Get it wrong and you'd bury your equipment or kill your crew. He learned to think in distances and weights, in angles and timing. He learned that most men guessed at these things, but the ones who survived in dangerous work were the ones who measured. When the draft notice came in March of 1918, Lewis arrived at Camp Funston already thinking like an engineer. Every problem reducible to physics, every solution dependent on proper execution. The meat grinder. The 77th Division had been hammering at the German defensive line in the Argonne for 16 days. The forest, supposedly passable, had turned into a nightmare of barbed wire and hidden strongpoints. Every ridgeline had a pillbox. Every clearing had overlapping fields of fire. The Germans had spent 4 years fortifying this ground, and they knew exactly how American infantry attacked. Line formations, suppressive fire, advance by rushes. On October 5th, Corporal Michael Hennessy from Brooklyn led 12 men in a flanking maneuver against a machine gun position designated Target 7. The Maxim opened fire at 180 yards. Hennessy took the first burst through his chest, dead before he hit the ground. 3 men behind him, Private DeMarco, Private Washington, Private Chen, fell within seconds. The rest crawled back under covering fire, leaving 4 bodies in the wire. On October 6th, Lieutenant Raymond Fletcher called for artillery support on the same position. The shells landed 30 yards short, throwing mud and shrapnel but leaving the concrete intact. When Fletcher led the assault anyway, the machine gun killed him and 7 others in 90 seconds. Private James O'Connor, aged 19, bled out in a shell hole calling for his mother. Private Thomas Reed, aged 21, lost both legs and died an hour later. Private Samuel Goldstein, age 18, took a round through the stomach and spent 4 hours dying in agony 20 yards from the German position, his screams audible to both sides. On October 7th, Captain William Foster requisitioned a flamethrower team. The 2 men carrying the 70-pound apparatus made it 80 yards before the Maxim found them. The fuel tank exploded, immolating both operators. Private Eugene Martinez burned to death. Private Carl Schmidt burned to death. Their bodies smoked in the mud for hours. 27 names. 27 men who'd crossed the Atlantic, survived the trenches, made it through 16 days of the bloodiest offensive of the war, dead because nobody could figure out how to silence one machine gun. Lewis watched each attack from various positions in the line. He watched officers plan their assaults using maps that showed terrain, but didn't account for the physics of suppressive fire. He watched good men die following doctrine that assumed you could overwhelm any position with enough bodies. Each time, sitting in his trench or his shell hole, he'd think about the grenades on his belt, think about the distance, think about whether his arm was strong enough. The forbidden solution. On the evening of October 7th, Lewis approached Captain Foster in the command dugout. The captain was writing letters to the families of the men killed that day, his hands shaking slightly as he formed the words. "Sir, I have a suggestion about Target 7. Foster looked up, eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. "Go ahead, Private." "I think I can grenade it, sir, from advanced cover. I've been measuring the distance. It's right at the edge of possible range." The captain set down his pen. "Private, the maximum effective range of a Mills bomb is 30 yards. That position is 200 yards from our forward line." "Yes, sir. But if I move up during darkness, use one of the craters at about 60 yards. 60 yards. Foster's voice went flat. "You think you can throw a grenade 60 yards? "I've been practicing, sir, with rocks, during rest periods. I can reach 70 on flat ground, with an elevated position." "Private Lewis." The captain stood up. "We do not waste grenades on impossible throws. We do not send men on suicide missions based on farm boy delusions about their throwing arm. That position will be taken by coordinated assault with proper support. You will not, under any circumstances, attempt this stunt. Do you understand?" "Sir, I really think—" "Do you understand, Private?" Lewis looked at the letters on the desk. Names he recognized. Men he'd eaten with, marched with. "Yes, sir. I understand." "Good. Dismissed." Walking back to his position, Lewis felt the grenades knocking against his ribs. He thought about Corporal Hennessy, who'd shown him how to keep his rifle clean in the mud. About Private Goldstein, who'd shared his last cigarette. About the fact that Doctrine said grenades were defensive weapons, but Doctrine hadn't saved 27 men. He decided that some rules existed to be broken by people who knew what they were doing. Preparation in darkness. At 2:30 in the morning on October 8th, Lewis began his crawl. He'd stripped down to trousers and shirt, leaving his pack and rifle behind. 8 grenades hung from his belt, secured with extra wire to prevent rattling. He'd wrapped the pins in cloth to keep them from catching on anything. His hands were covered in mud to prevent reflection. The crater he'd chosen was actually 73 yards from the German position. He'd measured it using the ranging technique the artillery observers used, comparing thumb width to known distances. The crater was deep, about 5 feet, with good cover and a sight line directly to the pillbox. The Germans had swept it with searchlights twice that evening, but it appeared abandoned. The crawl took 90 minutes. Move 6 inches, freeze, listen. Move 6 inches, freeze, listen. The mud was cold enough to numb his hands. Twice he heard German voices from the pillbox. Casual conversation, someone laughing. They felt safe in their concrete fortress. They'd killed nearly 30 men without taking a single casualty. Why wouldn't they flee? Safe? When Lewis reached the crater, he slid in carefully, letting the freezing water close around his legs. He tested his throwing position, making sure he had clearance for a full wind-up. The pillbox was a dark rectangle against slightly less dark sky. He could see the Maxim's barrel protruding from the firing slit, a thin line of darker black. He unwrapped the first grenade and felt its weight. The Mills bomb weighed 1 pound and 11 ounces, with a 4-second fuse. In training, they'd said never to cook off a grenade, Pull the pin and throw immediately. But 4 seconds of fuse meant the Germans could see it coming, could duck back into their shelter, could survive the blast. Lewis decided to cook it. 2 seconds in his hand, 2 seconds in the air. If he missed, it would detonate harmlessly in the mud. If he hit the slit, it would explode inside the pillbox before anyone could react. He pulled the pin, counted 1001, 1002, and threw. The physics of violence. The grenade left Lewis's hand with every ounce of strength he possessed, his shoulder rotating through the full overhand motion his father had taught him 20 years ago. The flat trajectory kept it low, reducing the arc, fighting gravity with velocity. He watched it sail through the darkness, a black oval against black sky, visible only because he knew where to look. It disappeared into the firing slit. The explosion came as a muffled crump, concrete and earth containing most of the blast. The Maxim gun went silent. Lewis heard screaming from inside the pillbox, German words, panicked, the sound of men trying to escape through the single rear exit. He'd already pulled the pin on the second grenade. Cook! Throw! This one hit the concrete next to the slit, exploding against the pillbox exterior. Shrapnel and fragments. More screaming. Third grenade. Fourth grenade. He threw them in rhythm, not aiming anymore, just saturating the position. By the 6th grenade, nothing was moving near the pillbox. By the 8th, Lewis's arm felt like rubber, shoulder burning, but the German position was silent. He waited in the crater, breathing hard, ears ringing from the concussions. Down the line, he heard American voices calling questions. Someone fired a flare. The pillbox sat in the sudden white light, pocked with shrapnel scars, black smoke drifting from the firing slit. Lewis slid out of the crater and crawled back toward American lines, moving fast now, not caring about noise. Behind him, he could hear German artillery starting to respond, shells screaming in toward where the explosions had been. He made it back to his trench just as the barrage started, tumbling over the parapet into mud and sandbags, while the ground erupted behind him. Corporal Davies grabbed him by the shirt. "What the hell was that? What did you do?" Lewis sat against the trench wall, arm throbbing, hands torn and bloody from the crawl. "Hit a lucky shell, I guess. German ammunition must have cooked off." Davies stared at him, then at the empty loops on Lewis's cartridge belt where 8 grenades should have been. "You stupid son of a bitch. Foster's going to have you shot." "Maybe." Lewis closed his eyes. But Target 7's gone. Questions without answers. Captain Foster found Lewis at dawn, sleeping against the fire step with his boots still covered in mud. The captain's face was unreadable. "Private Lewis, you will accompany me to battalion headquarters." They walked in silence through the communication trench. At headquarters, Major Hendricks sat behind a field desk covered in maps and casualty reports. He looked at Lewis the way a man looks at a strange insect. "Private, Captain Foster tells me you may have disobeyed a direct order last night." "Sir, I was in my assigned position when the German ammunition dump exploded." "Interesting, because we have no record of German ammunition in that position. We have intelligence suggesting it was a machine gun nest. Just a machine gun nest." "I wouldn't know about that, sir." The major picked up a report. "Our forward observers counted 8 separate explosions, consistent with fragmentation grenades, each impact centered on or near the pillbox." He looked up. "Where are your grenades, Private?" "Must have lost them in the confusion, sir. Things were pretty chaotic." Foster spoke up. "Sir, I specifically ordered Private Lewis not to attempt." "I'm aware of your orders, Captain." Hendricks set down the report. "Private Lewis, you wasted 8 grenades, violated doctrine, endangered yourself unnecessarily, and directly disobeyed your commanding officer." Lewis said nothing. "You also destroyed a position that killed 27 of our men and held up this entire sector for 3 days. First platoon advanced through that ground this morning without taking a single casualty." The major leaned back. "Captain Foster, what do you suggest we do with Private Lewis?" Foster's jaw worked. "Sir, the results speak for themselves." "Indeed they do." Hendricks looked at Lewis. "I'm putting you in for extra rations and a weekend pass when we're off the line. I'm also noting in my report that German ammunition stores were destroyed by unknown causes. Do you understand what I'm telling you, Private?" "Yes, sir. Unknown causes." Dismissed. The method spreads word traveled through the regiment within 48 hours. Private Lewis threw grenades at a German machine gun from 70 yards away. 8 throws, 8 hits. Target destroyed. Nobody official was talking about it, but everybody knew. On October 10th, Private Marcus Webb from 2nd Company crawled to within 65 yards of a German position in a similar pillbox. He'd been a baseball pitcher in Pennsylvania, played semi-pro before the war. He used Lewis's technique, night crawl, cooking off grenades, sustained barrage. The position fell silent after 6 throws. 12 men crossed that ground safely. On October 11th, Private Joseph Alvarez, former railroad worker from New Mexico, destroyed a machine gun nest from 80 yards using the same method. He'd practiced during rest periods, throwing rocks at fence posts until his arm ached. When the moment came, muscle memory took over. 7 grenades, 7 hits. By October 15th, 18 German positions had been neutralized by what the Germans started calling walking grenades. Lone American soldiers crawling close enough to bombard fortifications with sustained grenade attacks. German after-action reports noted the tactic specifically, recommended increased patrols around forward positions, suggested moving machine gun nests back to 200 yards from American lines. The American Expeditionary Forces recorded the change in casualty rates. Before October 8th, the 77th Division averaged 43 casualties per day in the Argonne sector. After October 8th, once the grenade-throwing method began spreading, casualties dropped to 18 per day. Over 2 weeks, the tactic saved an estimated 350 lives, men who crossed ground that would have killed them a week earlier. Nobody wrote orders about it. Nobody published tactical bulletins. The knowledge spread through the informal networks that always operate in armies. Privates talking to privates, corporals sharing techniques, men who'd seen it work, teaching men who needed to try it. Unofficial recognition. On October 20th, Major Hendricks called Lewis back to headquarters. This time, Colonel Matthew Harrison sat at the desk, the regimental commander, a career officer with 3 decades of service. "Private Lewis, I understand you've become something of a specialist." "Sir, I don't know what you mean." Harrison smiled thinly. "I'm told you can throw a grenade farther than regulations suggest is possible. I'm told other men have been learning from you. I'm told German casualty reports are now mentioning this specific tactic." Lewis said nothing. "Private, what you did was stupid, reckless, and violated every principle of munitions conservation." Harrison lit a cigarette. "It also worked, and it's saving lives. So here's what's going to happen. You're not going to be punished. You're not going to be promoted. You're going to spend the next 2 weeks training volunteers in grenade throwing, range techniques, cooking off fuses, target selection. Unofficial training, understand? No written records. If anyone asks, you're just practicing normal defensive skills." "Sir," Captain Foster said. "Captain Foster has been spoken to. He agrees that pragmatic results outweigh theoretical violations. We're fighting a war, Private. We use what works." Harrison stubbed out his cigarette. "But understand this. If you get yourself killed doing something this stupid, I'll have nothing good to say at your funeral. Clear?" "Clear, sir." For the next 14 days, Lewis ran training sessions in a quarry behind the lines. Men came from across the division, anyone who thought they had the arm for it. He taught them his father's overhand technique, taught them about balance points and flat trajectories. He taught them to cook grenades, count to 2, throw, let it explode in the air. He taught them to measure distances using thumb ranging, to identify good throwing positions, to crawl at night without making sound. 83 men went through the training. 47 used the technique successfully in combat before the armistice. German positions that would have taken days to reduce fell in minutes. Ground that would have cost dozens of lives was taken with single casualties. None of it appeared in official reports. None of it earned medals or commendations. The innovation existed in the space between doctrine and necessity, spread by men who cared more about survival than regulations. John Lewis returned to Missouri in February 1919. No parades, no ceremonies, just a train ticket and discharge papers. He went back to the quarry, back to mixing dynamite charges and calculating blast patterns. He never talked about the war except once, to a nephew who asked what he'd done in France. I threw things at people who were shooting at my friends, Lewis said. Turned out I was pretty good at it. He died in 1962, aged 67, from lung disease related to quarry dust. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his military service in one sentence. No details about grenades or machine gun nests or the 350 lives his technique helped save. In 1923, the U.S. Army published a new field manual that included a section on extended-range grenade tactics for suppressing fortified positions. The manual recommended soldiers with demonstrated throwing ability be identified during training and given specialized instruction. It suggested cooking off grenades could be tactically viable in specific circumstances. It noted that maximum effective range should be considered flexible based on individual capability. The manual didn't mention John Lewis or Marcus Webb or Joseph Alvarez. It didn't mention the Argonne Forest or Target 7 or the 27 men who died before someone broke the rules. It just laid out the technique as though it had always existed, as though it had been discovered by proper military research rather than desperate improvisation. That's how real innovation works, not through official channels, not through proper procedure, but through some person who sees the problem clearly enough to ignore the rules. They do the impossible thing. They survive or they don't. If it works, the method spreads. If enough people survive because of it, eventually the institution claims credit. John Lewis threw 8 grenades from a muddy crater at a German pillbox because nobody else had figured out how to stop men from dying. He violated orders, wasted munitions, and did something his superiors considered impossible. He saved lives by refusing to accept that the official way was the only way. History doesn't remember men like Lewis well. There's no monument, no battle named after him, no chapter in the textbooks. Just a technique in a field manual, the names of men who didn't die, and the quiet knowledge that sometimes the best solutions come from people who trust their hands more than doctrine.